In the quiet corridors of Buckingham Palace, where whispers carry more weight than proclamations, a single act of defiance would change the monarchy forever. Princess, and known for her no-nonsense approach and unwavering principles, had reached her breaking point. What she did next would force King Charles into the most difficult decision of his reign, create a rift that threatened the very foundation of the royal family, and leave Queen Camilla seething with a fury that palace insiders had never witnessed before. This is not just another royal controversy. This is the story of how one woman's courage to stand up for what she believed was right would expose decades of hidden tensions, force long-buried secrets into the light, and ultimately reshape the British monarchy in ways no one could have predicted. The events that unfolded over those dramatic weeks would be remembered as the moment when the House of Windsor faced its greatest internal crisis since the abdication of King Edward VIII. What Princess Anne discovered, and what she chose to do about it, would test family loyalty, challenge royal protocol, and prove that even in the 21st century, the crown could still tremble when confronted with uncomfortable truths. The morning mist hung heavy over the grounds of Gatcombe Park as Princess and finished her early ride through the countryside. At 74, she maintained the same rigorous schedule that had defined her entire life, rising before dawn to tend to her horses before the demands of royal duty took over. But today felt different. Today, the weight of what she had discovered pressed against her chest like a stone. 3 days earlier, and had been reviewing documents for an upcoming charity event when she stumbled upon correspondence that made her blood run cold. Hidden among routine paperwork from the palace was a series of financial records that revealed systematic misappropriation of funds from several royal charities. The amounts were staggering, and the trail led directly to someone she had trusted implicitly for years. The discovery had kept her awake for nights, pacing the floors of her private quarters while wrestling with the implications. This wasn't just about money, though the sums involved could have fed thousands of families or funded countless worthy causes. This was about betrayal at the highest levels of the monarchy, a betrayal that struck at the very heart of what the royal family claimed to represent, and had always prided herself on her straightforward approach to life and duty. Unlike some members of her family, she had never been one for diplomatic dancing or careful political maneuvering. When she saw a problem, she addressed it head-on, consequences be damned. This trait had served her well throughout her decades of public service, earning her respect even from those who might otherwise question the relevance of the monarchy. But this situation was different. This wasn't about a scheduling conflict or a disagreement over protocol. This was about criminal activity happening under the royal banner, activity that could destroy public trust in the institution she had devoted her life to serving. The evidence was clear, documented in black and white, yet she knew that exposing it would create a scandal unlike anything the royal family had faced in decades. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday afternoon while Anne was reviewing her schedule for the following week. Her private secretary, Margaret, knocked softly on the door of her office before entering with a concerned expression. "Your Royal Highness, there's someone on the line who insists on speaking with you directly. She says it's about the Meadowbrook Children's Foundation." Anne's heart skipped a beat. The Meadowbrook Foundation was one of the charities mentioned in the documents she had discovered. She had hoped against hope that she was wrong about what the paperwork suggested, but the tremor in Margaret's voice told her that her worst fears were about to be confirmed. "Put her through," Anne said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her mind. The woman on the other end of the line introduced herself as Sarah Williams, a former accountant who had worked for several royal charities before being abruptly dismissed 6 months earlier. Her voice shook as she explained why she was calling. "Your Royal Highness, I've been trying to find the courage to speak up for months. I was let go because I started asking questions about irregularities in the financial records. At first, I thought it might be simple accounting errors, but the more I investigated, the more I realized it was something much worse." And listened in growing horror as Sarah detailed a complex scheme involving the diversion of charitable funds into private accounts. The operation had been running for years, with money meant for disadvantaged children, elderly care programs, and veteran support being systematically siphoned off for personal use. "I have copies of everything," Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. Bank transfers, forged signatures, altered donation records. I was too scared to come forward before because I knew how powerful these people are, but I can't stay silent anymore. Too many people are suffering while this money disappears into the pockets of those who already have everything. After the call ended, and sat in silence for a long time, staring out at the grounds where she had played as a child. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders like a physical force. She knew that once she acted on this information, there would be no going back. The scandal would consume everything in its path, including people she cared about. But she also knew that she had no choice. The evidence was overwhelming, and, more importantly, her conscience would never allow her to look the other way while vulnerable people suffered for the greed of others. The values her mother had instilled in her, the principles that had guided her through decades of public service, demanded that she act regardless of the personal cost. The first person she called was her brother Andrew, not because she expected his support, but because she felt he deserved to hear about the situation from her directly. The conversation was brief and tense, with Andrew immediately going on the defensive and suggesting that and was overreacting to what he claimed were simple accounting discrepancies. "You're making a mountain out of a molehill," he said, his voice tight with anger. "These charity finances are complex, and you don't understand all the nuances involved. If you go public with half-baked accusations, you'll damage not just individual reputations, but the entire royal family." Anne's response was characteristically direct. "Andrew, I've seen the evidence. This isn't about accounting discrepancies. This is about theft on a massive scale, theft from charities that serve the most vulnerable members of our society. If you think I'm going to stay quiet about that to protect anyone's reputation, including our own, then you don't know me at all." The conversation ended with Andrew warning her to think carefully about the consequences of her actions, not just for herself, but for the monarchy as a whole, and hung up feeling more isolated than ever, but also more resolved. If her own family couldn't see the moral imperative to act, then she would have to bear this burden alone. Her next call was to Charles, but reaching the king proved more difficult than she had anticipated. His private secretary informed her that His Majesty was in meetings all day and wouldn't be available until the following evening, and suspected that word of her inquiries had already reached certain ears, and that forces were mobilizing to contain the situation before it could explode into public view. That evening, as she walked through her gardens in the fading light and reflected on the path that had brought her to this moment, she had always been the hardest working member of the royal family, carrying out more engagements than any of her siblings while maintaining a dignified silence about the various scandals that had plagued the House of Windsor over the years. She had watched as her family weathered divorces, affairs, and countless controversies, always putting duty before personal feelings. But this felt different. This wasn't about personal failings or relationship drama that, while embarrassing, didn't fundamentally damage the institution's ability to serve the public good. This was about corruption that struck at the very heart of what the monarchy claimed to represent. If the royal family couldn't be trusted to properly manage charitable funds meant for the most vulnerable members of society, then what was their purpose? The call from Sarah Williams had provided the final piece of evidence and needed to confirm her worst suspicions. The scheme involved multiple charities and appeared to be coordinated by someone with intimate knowledge of royal financial protocols and access to sensitive information. The sophistication of the operation suggested involvement at the highest levels, which meant that exposing it would require her to challenge some of the most powerful people in her orbit. As she prepared for bed that night and made the decision that would change everything, she would not wait for permission or approval from Charles or anyone else. The evidence was clear, the moral imperative was obvious, and her duty to the people who supported these charities outweighed any obligation to protect the reputation of individuals who had betrayed that trust. The next morning, she began making the arrangements that would culminate in her historic protest. She contacted investigative journalists known for their integrity and thorough research, providing them with copies of the evidence while making it clear that she was acting independently, not as a representative of the royal family. She also reached out to law enforcement agencies, ensuring that the proper authorities would be notified of the criminal activity, and knew that simply providing evidence to outside parties wouldn't be enough. The public needed to understand that at least one member of the royal family was willing to put principles before personal comfort, that not everyone with a title was willing to look the other way when confronted with wrongdoing. What she planned to do next would shock the world and force her family to confront truths they had spent years trying to avoid. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the very foundations of the British monarchy, and Princess stood at the center of it all, ready to sacrifice everything she had built for the sake of what she knew was right. The tension inside Buckingham Palace was thick enough to cut with a knife as Princess strode through the corridors toward the throne room, where the annual Charity Trustees meeting was about to begin. She carried herself with the same regal bearing that had characterized her public appearances for decades. But those who knew her well could see the steel in her eyes and the slight tension in her jaw that suggested she was prepared for battle. The meeting was supposed to be a routine affair, bringing together the leaders of various royal charities to review the previous year's activities and plan for the future. It was exactly the kind of formal, dignified gathering that the palace preferred, where everyone spoke in careful, measured tones and controversial topics were diplomatically avoided. And had other plans for this particular gathering. As the trustees filed into the ornate room and noticed the careful seating arrangement that had been designed to minimize potential conflicts, she had been placed at the far end of the table from several key figures, including Lord Pemberton, the chairman of the Royal Children's Trust, and Lady Whitfield, who oversaw financial operations for 3 major royal charities. Both had been prominently featured in the documents Sarah Williams had provided, and both had avoided Anne's calls over the past week. King Charles entered the room precisely at 10 o'clock, his presence immediately commanding the attention of everyone present. He had agreed to open the meeting with brief remarks before leaving for other appointments, a decision Anne suspected was designed to limit his exposure to whatever she might have planned. The tension between the siblings had been palpable during their brief conversation the previous evening, when Charles had made it clear that he expected her to handle any concerns through proper channels rather than creating unnecessary drama. I want to start by thanking all of you for your continued dedication to the charitable work that forms such an important part of our royal mission, Charles began, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of decades in public life. The work you do touches the lives of countless individuals and families across our realm and beyond. Your stewardship of the public's generosity is a sacred trust that reflects the very best of our shared values. And felt a bitter irony in her brother's words about sacred trust and stewardship, knowing what she knew about how some of that trust had been violated. She waited patiently as Charles continued with his prepared remarks, discussing recent successes and future goals. When he finished and prepared to leave, she knew her moment had arrived. "Before you go, Charles, I believe there's something this gathering needs to address," Anne said, her voice carrying clearly across the room. The formality of using his name rather than his title sent a subtle but unmistakable signal that she was speaking not just as a sister, but as an equal member of the royal family with her own authority and responsibilities. Charles paused, his hand already on the door handle. "I'm sure whatever concerns you have can be addressed with the appropriate committee members. And my schedule today is quite full." "I'm afraid this can't wait," Anne replied, standing to face the room. "What I have to say affects everyone here, and indeed everyone who has ever donated money or time to any of our royal charities in the belief that their contributions would be used for the purposes they intended." The atmosphere in the room shifted perceptibly as Anne's words sank in. Several trustees exchanged nervous glances, while others leaned forward with curiosity. Charles slowly returned to his position at the head of the table, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes reflecting a growing concern about what was coming next, and walked to the center of the room, carrying a folder containing copies of the evidence she had gathered. "3 weeks ago, I discovered financial irregularities in several of our charitable operations that go far beyond simple accounting errors. What I found was evidence of systematic embezzlement involving millions of pounds meant for children's hospitals, veterans programs, and elderly care initiatives. The words hung in the air like an accusation, and the reaction was immediate. Lord Pemberton half rose from his chair, his face flushed with indignation. "Your Royal Highness, I must protest these unfounded accusations. If you have concerns about financial procedures, there are proper channels for raising them, not public forums where reputations can be unfairly damaged." And turned to face him directly, her expression unwavering. "Lord Pemberton, I'm curious about your reaction, considering that I haven't yet mentioned any specific names or organizations. Your defensive response suggests you already know what I'm talking about." Lady Whitfield attempted to intervene, her voice artificially calm, but with an underlying tremor. Perhaps what Her Royal Highness is referring to are the complex financial arrangements that sometimes become necessary when managing multiple charitable streams. These can appear irregular to those unfamiliar with the intricacies of charitable finance. "I'm quite familiar with charitable finance, Lady Whitfield," and replied coldly. "Familiar enough to recognize the difference between complex arrangements and outright theft. I'm also familiar enough to know that when money donated for children's cancer treatment ends up in personal investment accounts, that's not a complex arrangement. That's a crime." The room erupted into a cacophony of voices as trustees began speaking over each other, some demanding to know the source of Anne's information, while others called for calm and proper procedures. Through it all, Charles remained silent, his face growing paler as the implications of his sister's accusations became clear. Anne raised her hand for silence, and such was her authority in the room that the voices gradually died down. "I want to be absolutely clear about what I'm saying here today," she continued. "I have documented evidence of fraudulent activity involving multiple royal charities. This evidence has been turned over to the appropriate law enforcement agencies and to investigative journalists who have verified its authenticity independently." The gasps and murmurs that followed this announcement were quickly drowned out by Lord Pemberton's angry voice. "This is preposterous. Your Royal Highness is making wild accusations based on what, exactly? Gossip and rumors? I demand to know the source of these supposed documents." Anne opened her folder and began reading from the documents inside. "Bank transfer from the Royal Children's Trust account to Pemberton Holdings, dated March 15th, amount £250,000. Memo line lists this as administrative services, but there's no corresponding contract or documentation for any services provided. Would you like me to continue, Lord Pemberton, or can you explain this transaction yourself?" The color drained from Pemberton's face as Anne's words hit their mark. Around the table, other trustees began shifting uncomfortably in their seats, clearly wondering what other damaging information might be revealed. Lady Whitfield attempted to maintain her composure, but her hands shook slightly as she reached for her water glass. Charles finally found his voice. "And these are serious allegations that require careful investigation through proper channels. This public forum is neither the time nor the place for such accusations." "You're absolutely right, Charles," Anne replied, her tone becoming more formal. "These allegations are serious enough that they demanded immediate action. That's why I've already taken them to the proper authorities, including Scotland Yard's Financial Crimes Unit and the Charity Commission. What I'm doing here today is fulfilling my obligation to inform this body that several of its members are under criminal investigation." The impact of this revelation was immediate and devastating. Several trustees began speaking at once, demanding details and protesting their innocence. Others sat in stunned silence, clearly calculating the potential damage to their own reputations and positions. The carefully orchestrated dignity of the royal charity meeting had collapsed into chaos. Through the tumult, Anne continued speaking, her voice cutting through the noise with practiced authority. "For too long, we have allowed the protection of reputations and the avoidance of scandal to take precedence over our fundamental duty to the people we serve. The British public trusts us with their charitable donations because they believe in the integrity of our institutions. When that integrity is compromised, it becomes our responsibility to act, regardless of personal cost. King Charles attempted to regain control of the situation. I think we should adjourn this meeting immediately and address these matters through appropriate private channels. But, and was far from finished. There will be no more private channels, no more quiet conversations behind closed doors. The public deserves to know when their trust has been betrayed, and they deserve to see that at least some members of this family are willing to stand up for what's right instead of what's convenient. She turned to address the room as a whole, her voice rising with passion. Some of you sitting at this table have betrayed the most vulnerable members of our society. You've stolen from sick children, from elderly people struggling to maintain their dignity, from veterans who served our country with honor. You did this while hiding behind royal titles and charitable purposes, believing that your positions would protect you from consequences. The accusation hung heavy in the air as it paused, allowing its full weight to settle on those present. When she continued, her voice was quieter but no less determined. I want everyone in this room to understand that your positions will not protect you. Your titles will not protect you. Your connections to this family will not protect you. The law will take its course, and justice will be served. Lady Whitfield finally broke under the pressure, her carefully maintained composure cracking as tears began streaming down her face. "You don't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. The money was just being redirected temporarily to accounts that could provide better returns. We were going to put it all back." Anne's expression softened slightly, but her resolve remained firm. "Lady Whitfield, the children who didn't receive treatment because their funding was temporarily redirected don't care about your intentions. The families who couldn't afford care because their support programs were underfunded don't care about your investment strategies. Good intentions don't excuse theft, and temporary redirections that last for years aren't temporary at all." The meeting devolved further as more details emerged and accusations flew back and forth. Some trustees demanded legal representation before saying anything more, while others began providing their own versions of events in an attempt to minimize their involvement. Through it all, Princess Anne remained standing at the center of the storm, the calm eye around which the chaos swirled. When the session finally ended nearly 3 hours later, the landscape of royal charitable work had been forever changed. Several trustees had resigned on the spot. Others had been suspended pending investigation, and the remaining members faced the daunting task of rebuilding public trust in institutions that had been fundamentally compromised. As the room emptied, Charles approached his sister with a mixture of anger and resignation. "You realize what you've done today will have consequences far beyond these charities," he said quietly. "The monarchy itself will be damaged by this scandal." And looked at her brother with a combination of sadness and determination. "Charles, the monarchy was already damaged by this scandal. The only difference is that now the damage is visible, which means it can finally begin to heal." But even as she spoke these words, and knew that the real confrontation was yet to come, Camilla had been notably absent from the meeting, and was certain that news of the day's events would reach the queen consort quickly. And when it did, Anne suspected that her boldest challenge yet lay ahead. The summons to Clarence House arrived the next morning, delivered by a palace courier whose grave expression suggested the urgency of the matter. Princess Anne had expected this confrontation, but she hadn't anticipated it would come so quickly or with such formal protocol. The message was brief and to the point. Queen Camilla requested her immediate presence for a private discussion regarding recent events, and arrived at Clarence House just after 2 o'clock, her car pulling through the gates as photographers gathered outside, clearly alerted to the developing story. Word of the charity meeting had already begun leaking to the press, despite the palace's best efforts to contain the situation. The morning newspapers had run preliminary stories based on unnamed sources, and knew that by evening, the full scope of her revelations would be front-page news across the country. The staff at Clarence's house greeted Anne with the usual courtesy, but she could sense an underlying tension in their demeanor. Even the longtime servants who had known her for years seemed uncertain about how to behave in the face of what was clearly an unprecedented family crisis. She was escorted not to one of the formal reception rooms, but to Camilla's private sitting room, a choice that suggested this would be a very personal conversation. Camilla was waiting by the window, still dressed in the cream-colored suit she had worn to a morning engagement, but her usual composed demeanor was nowhere to be seen. When she turned to face Anne, her expression was a mixture of fury and disbelief that spoke to the depth of her emotional response to the previous day's events. "And," Camilla began, her voice tight with controlled anger, "I want to understand exactly what you think you've accomplished with yesterday's performance." And settled into one of the chairs arranged near the fireplace, her posture relaxed but alert. "I think I've accomplished exactly what was necessary, Camilla. I've exposed criminal activity and ensured that those responsible will face justice." "Criminal activity," Camilla repeated, her tone dripping with skepticism. "What you've done is destroy years of careful relationship building and charitable work based on accusations that you haven't even allowed the family to investigate properly. Do you have any idea how much damage you've caused to our reputation?" The emphasis on "our" was not lost on Anne, who recognized the possessive claim behind Camilla's words. As queen consort, Camilla had worked tirelessly to establish her own legitimacy within the royal family, and Anne's actions threatened to undermine not just specific charitable operations, but the broader public trust that Camilla had worked so hard to build. "I understand that you're concerned about reputation," Anne replied carefully, "but I'm more concerned about the people who were harmed by the theft of funds meant to help them. The reputation of the monarchy should be built on our commitment to serving others, not on our ability to cover up wrongdoing when it becomes inconvenient." Camilla's composure finally cracked, her voice rising with emotion. "Inconvenient? And you've potentially destroyed the careers and lives of people who have dedicated years to charitable work based on documents that may have been taken out of context or misinterpreted. You've created a scandal that will overshadow every positive thing this family accomplishes for months or even years to come." "The documents weren't taken out of context," and responded firmly. "They were corroborated by multiple sources, including a former accountant who was fired for asking questions about the irregularities. The evidence is overwhelming, Camilla, and denying it won't make it go away." Camilla began pacing the room, her agitation evident in every movement. Even if there were irregularities, there were ways to handle this privately, through internal investigations and quiet corrections. You didn't have to make a public spectacle that damages everyone involved, including innocent people whose only crime was trusting the wrong individuals. And watched her sister-in-law's distress with a mixture of sympathy and frustration. She could understand Camilla's perspective, but she couldn't accept the underlying assumption that protecting the family's image was more important than protecting the people they were meant to serve. "Camilla, those innocent people you're worried about include children with cancer whose treatment was delayed because funding was diverted to private accounts. They include elderly individuals who couldn't access care programs because the money meant to support them was being used to finance luxury lifestyles. How do you weigh their suffering against our reputation?" The question hung in the air between them, highlighting the fundamental difference in their approaches to the crisis. For Camilla, the primary concern was managing the public relations damage and protecting the institution. For Anne, the primary concern was ensuring justice for those who had been harmed and preventing further harm. "You're being naive," and Camilla said, finally, stopping her pacing to face her directly. "You think that exposing this scandal will somehow help those people, but what it will actually do is destroy public confidence in all royal charities. People will stop donating, volunteers will withdraw their support, and ultimately, everyone who depends on our charitable work will suffer." It was a sophisticated argument, and had to admit that Camilla had raised a legitimate concern. The scandal would indeed damage public trust in royal charities, potentially affecting the good work being done by honest organizations. But and believed that the long-term health of these institutions depended on confronting problems honestly rather than covering them up. That's a risk I was willing to take and acknowledged. But I believe people are smarter and more forgiving than you're giving them credit for. They can distinguish between institutions that cover up wrongdoing and those that expose and correct it. By acting decisively against corruption, we show that we take our responsibilities seriously. Camilla shook her head in frustration. You still don't understand the larger implications of what you've done. This isn't just about charity finances anymore. The press is already asking questions about what else might be hidden, about whether this family can be trusted with any aspect of public service. You've opened a door that we may not be able to close. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door, followed by the entrance of one of Camilla's private secretaries. The young woman looked extremely uncomfortable as she approached the queen consort with a folder of papers. I'm sorry to interrupt, Your Majesty, but these are the initial press reports that have been filed in the last hour. The communications team thought you should see them immediately. Camilla took the folder with visible reluctance, her face growing paler as she scanned the headlines and opening paragraphs, and could see from across the room that the coverage was extensive and sensational, exactly the kind of media-feeding frenzy that the palace worked so hard to avoid. Royal charity scandal exposes palace corruption, Camilla read aloud, her voice heavy with resignation. Princess and breaks royal silence on financial crimes. They're calling you a whistleblower, and they're treating this like you're some kind of heroic figure standing up against a corrupt system. And felt a mixture of satisfaction and concern at this news. While she was glad that her motivations were being understood correctly, she worried about how the heroic narrative might affect her relationships within the family and her ability to continue her work. I never intended to be seen as heroic, and said quietly. I just did what I felt was necessary under the circumstances. Well, intention or not, that's exactly how you're being portrayed, Camilla replied, setting the folder aside with obvious distaste. And that makes the rest of us look like either accomplices or cowards who were unwilling to act when we learned about these problems. The implication was clear, and his decision to go public had not only exposed the criminal activity, but had also created an unflattering contrast between her principled stand and the family's traditional preference for handling problems privately. This dynamic would inevitably affect how the public viewed other members of the royal family, including Camilla herself. I'm sorry that my actions have put you in a difficult position, and said, and she meant it sincerely. Despite their disagreements, she respected Camilla's dedication to her royal duties and understood the challenges she faced as a relative newcomer to the family trying to establish her own legacy. Sorry doesn't fix the situation we're now facing, Camilla responded, though her tone had lost some of its earlier anger. Charles is beside himself trying to figure out how to respond to this crisis. He feels trapped between supporting you as his sister and protecting the institution as its head. This revelation about Charles's state of mind troubled and more than she cared to admit. She had known that her actions would create difficulties for her brother, but she had hoped that he would ultimately understand and support her decision. The idea that he felt genuinely torn suggested that the family rift might be deeper and more lasting than she had anticipated. What does Charles want me to do? And asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. He wants you to issue a statement clarifying that your accusations were based on preliminary information that requires further investigation. He wants you to acknowledge that you may have acted hastily and commit to working through proper channels going forward, and felt her jaw tighten at this suggestion. In other words, he wants me to undermine my own credibility and suggest that the evidence I presented might be unreliable. That would essentially let the guilty parties escape justice while making me look like someone who makes serious accusations without proper foundation. It would allow the family to present a united front while still addressing the underlying issues through appropriate channels, Camilla corrected. It's not about letting anyone escape justice. It's about handling justice in a way that doesn't destroy everything we've built in the process. The fundamental disagreement between them had crystallized into this moment. Camilla believed that the institution's survival required careful management of public perception and gradual reform behind the scenes, and believed that the institution's credibility required immediate, transparent action against wrongdoing, regardless of short-term damage to reputation. "I can't do what Charles is asking," and said finally. "The evidence is solid, the accusations are justified, and the people who were harmed deserve to see that their suffering is taken seriously. If I back down now, it sends a message that royal titles are more important than justice." Camilla's response was swift and sharp. "And if you don't back down, it sends a message that this family is so dysfunctional that we can't even agree on how to handle our own problems. It tells the world that we're more interested in fighting each other than in serving the public good." The conversation continued for another hour, with both women holding firmly to their positions while trying to understand each other's perspectives. As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that no compromise was possible, and would not retract or soften her accusations, and Camilla could not accept the ongoing damage to the family's reputation. When and finally left Clarence's house, she knew that she had crossed a line from which there might be no return. The family crisis that had begun with her discovery of financial irregularities had evolved into something much larger and more personal. The battle lines were now clearly drawn, and the next move would determine not just the fate of the individuals involved in the charity scandal, but the future direction of the monarchy itself. The call from Buckingham Palace came at 6 o'clock that evening, just as Princess Anne was settling down to dinner at Gatcombe Park. Her private secretary's voice was unusually tense as she informed, and that King Charles required her presence for an emergency family meeting scheduled for 8 o'clock that night. The formal tone and urgent timing left no doubt that this would be the most consequential conversation of Anne's royal career. The drive to London gave Anne time to reflect on how quickly everything had escalated. Less than a week had passed since she first confronted the charity trustees with evidence of financial corruption, yet it felt like months. The media coverage had been relentless, with new revelations emerging daily as investigative journalists followed the lead she had provided. 3 arrests had already been made, including Lord Pemberton, whose financial records revealed a pattern of systematic theft spanning nearly a decade. But, perhaps more significantly, Anne's actions had sparked a broader conversation about accountability and transparency within royal institutions. Editorial pages across the country were praising her courage while questioning why it had taken so long for these problems to come to light. Public opinion polls showed overwhelming support for her decision to speak out, with many respondents saying they trusted the royal family more, not less, because one member had been willing to expose wrongdoing. This public support had only deepened the rift within the family itself. While Anne received thousands of letters and emails praising her integrity, she knew that behind palace walls, her relatives viewed her as a troublemaker who had prioritized personal principles over institutional loyalty. The tension had reached a breaking point, and tonight's meeting would determine whether the family could find a way forward together or would be permanently divided. As Anne's car approached the palace gates, she noticed the increased security presence and the clusters of photographers and reporters hoping to catch a glimpse of the unfolding drama. The scandal had become a global news story, with international media outlets framing it as a test of whether modern monarchies could adapt to 21st century expectations of transparency and accountability. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was markedly different from the usual formal courtesy Anne had experienced throughout her life. Staff members who normally greeted her warmly now offered only polite nods, clearly uncertain about how to navigate the family conflict. Some seemed sympathetic to her position, while others appeared disapproving of the chaos her actions had created. The meeting was being held in the same room where Anne had made her initial accusations, a choice that seemed deliberately designed to emphasize the significance of the moment. When she entered, she found Charles already seated at the head of the table, with Camilla to his right and several of his closest advisors arranged around them. The absence of other family members, particularly William and Catherine, suggested that this was being treated as a matter requiring only the most senior decision-makers. Charles looked older than and had seen him in years, the stress of the past week evident in the lines around his eyes and the tension in his shoulders. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had been forced to make an impossible choice between competing loyalties and responsibilities. And I want you to know that what happens in this room tonight will determine not just your future role in this family, but the future of the monarchy itself. He began, his words carrying both gravity and sadness. The situation you've created has forced me to make decisions I never wanted to face, and took her seat across from Camilla, noting the careful positioning that placed them as adversaries rather than family members. I understand the difficulty of your position, Charles, but I hope you also understand that I had no choice but to act as I did. The evidence of wrongdoing was overwhelming, and remaining silent would have made me complicit in the harm being done to vulnerable people. The evidence, Charles repeated, his voice taking on a harder edge. Let's talk about this evidence that you felt justified sharing with journalists and law enforcement before discussing it with your own family. Do you realize that your actions have triggered investigations that extend far beyond the specific irregularities you discovered? Every royal charity is now under scrutiny. Every financial transaction is being questioned. One of the advisors, Sir Geoffrey Hartwell, leaned forward to add his perspective. Your Royal Highness, the damage to public trust is already significant and maybe irreversible. Our preliminary polling shows that while many people support your specific actions, overall confidence in royal institutions has declined substantially. The perception is that this family knew about problems and did nothing until forced to act, and felt her temper rising at this characterization of events. The perception is accurate, Geoffrey. We didn't know about problems, or at least some of us did, and nothing was being done to address them. If that damages public trust, then perhaps it's because the public deserves better from us. Camilla finally spoke, her voice carefully controlled, but with an underlying current of anger that had been building for days. What the public deserves is leadership that considers consequences before acting, not individuals who create chaos and then claim moral superiority. You've damaged not just specific people and organizations, but the entire concept of royal service. The accusation stung because and recognized some truth in it. Her decision to go public had indeed created chaos, and she couldn't entirely predict or control the long-term consequences. But she remained convinced that the alternative, continued silence and cover-up, would have been far worse. I've damaged the illusion that royal service is somehow immune from the same standards of accountability that apply to everyone else, and replied, if that illusion was necessary for our relevance, then perhaps our relevance was built on a false foundation. Charles raised his hand to forestall the argument that was clearly developing between the two women. We're not here to debate the philosophical foundations of monarchy. We're here to determine how this family moves forward in the face of an unprecedented crisis. The question before us is whether we can present a united front or whether the divisions between us have become irreparable. Sir Geoffrey consulted his notes before speaking again. Your Majesty, our communications team has prepared several possible approaches. We could position this as a successful internal reform effort, with Princess Anne's actions representing the family's commitment to transparency and accountability. Alternatively, we could frame it as an unfortunate overreaction to problems that were already being addressed through proper channels, and immediately understood the implications of these two approaches. The first would essentially validate her actions and make her a hero within the family narrative, while the second would cast her as a well-meaning but reckless figure who had acted without proper authority or consideration. I won't be party to any narrative that suggests the problems were already being addressed, and said firmly. The evidence clearly shows that wrongdoing had been occurring for years without any meaningful intervention. Creating false histories to protect people's feelings serves no one's interests. Camilla's response was swift and sharp, and I won't be party to any narrative that portrays this family as corrupt or incompetent. We've spent decades building public trust, and demonstrating our value to the nation. I won't see that destroyed by someone's need to play the role of righteous reformer. The personal nature of Camilla's attack caught and off guard, revealing the depth of resentment that had been building behind the queen consort's carefully maintained diplomatic facade. For the first time since the crisis began, and wondered whether the family relationship she had taken for granted might be irreparably damaged. Charles seemed to sense the dangerous direction of the conversation and attempted to refocus on practical solutions. The reality is that we need to make decisions based on what's best for the institution and the people we serve, not on personal feelings or family dynamics. The question is whether Anne's approach of aggressive transparency serves those interests better than our traditional approach of careful, private reform. This framing of the issue allowed and to address the fundamental disagreement that had been driving the conflict from the beginning. Charles, the traditional approach failed. It failed the people whose money was stolen, it failed the beneficiaries who didn't receive the help they needed, and it failed the honest charity workers whose reputations have been damaged by association with corruption. Sometimes aggressive transparency is the only way to restore trust. Sir Geoffrey presented polling data that complicated this argument. The public response has been mixed, Your Majesty. While Princess Anne personally has received positive coverage, support for the monarchy as an institution has declined. Many people are asking what else might be hidden and whether royal oversight of charitable activities is adequate. These findings highlighted the dilemma that had been troubling Charles throughout the crisis. Anne's actions had indeed exposed and stopped criminal activity, but they had also raised broader questions about royal competence and oversight that threatened to damage the institution's long-term viability. The conversation continued for nearly 3 hours, with various advisors presenting analysis and recommendations while the family members struggled to find common ground. As the evening wore on, it became increasingly clear that the fundamental philosophical differences between Anne and Camilla could not be easily resolved. Finally, Charles called for a break in the proceedings, asking to speak with him privately. When the room cleared, leaving only the two siblings, the formal atmosphere gave way to something more personal and painful. "And I need you to understand that I'm proud of what you did," Charles said quietly, his voice heavy with emotion. "Your courage and integrity are exactly what our mother would have expected from any of us. But I'm also terrified about what comes next. The institution that we've devoted our lives to serving is under threat, and I don't know how to protect it while also supporting you." And felt tears forming in her eyes as she heard the genuine anguish in her brother's voice. "Charles, I never wanted to put you in this position, but I couldn't live with myself if I had stayed silent while people suffered for others' greed. If protecting the institution requires us to ignore criminal activity, then maybe the institution needs to change." The king looked out the window at the crowds of reporters still gathered outside the palace gates. "The decision I have to make tonight will affect everything we do going forward. I can either ask you to step back from your public role until this crisis passes, or I can fully support your actions and accept whatever consequences follow." And understood that her brother was offering her a choice: retreat quietly and eventually resume her normal duties, or continue to stand by her principles and face whatever personal and professional consequences might result. It was the kind of moment that defines not just individual careers, but family legacies. "I can't step back, Charles," she said finally. "Too many people are counting on us to follow through on the reforms this crisis has made possible. If I retreat now, it sends the message that royal principles are negotiable when they become inconvenient." Charles nodded slowly, as if he had expected this answer, but still hoped it might be different. "Then we move forward together, and we accept whatever consequences that brings. And I need you to understand that this decision will change everything for all of us. There's no going back to the way things were." When the meeting reconvened, Charles announced his decision to the assembled group. The royal family would stand united behind the principle that accountability and transparency were essential to their mission of public service. They would implement comprehensive reforms of charitable oversight, support law enforcement investigations wherever they led, and accept that short-term damage to their reputation was preferable to long-term complicity in wrongdoing. The announcement was met with a mixture of relief and concern from the advisors present, who understood that they were embarking on an unprecedented experiment in royal transparency. Camilla's expression remained carefully neutral, and could see the disappointment and worry in her eyes. As the meeting ended and people began filing out of the room and realized that she had achieved something remarkable, but at a tremendous cost. The corruption had been exposed, reforms were being implemented, and justice was being served. But the family unity that had sustained the monarchy through previous crises had been severely damaged, and it remained to be seen whether it could be rebuilt on a new foundation of transparency and accountability. The weeks that followed would test whether the British monarchy could reinvent itself for a new era while maintaining the public trust that was essential to its survival. Princess Anne had forced her family to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and their institutions, and now they would all have to live with the consequences of that confrontation.